Hello, Dr. George.
Hi, Madhavi.
Thank you for agreeing to speak at the International Early Intervention Summit. We are doing it for the first time in India. And during the lockdown, we are doing it to see if it works. And it seems to be working. And all the speakers have agreed to speak, even though we requested a week or two before the schedule. And thank you again. We are pushing you to the limits by demanding your time all the time. Thank you so much for agreeing. I'm going to start with your profile and then you can start your presentation.
Sure.
Dr. Binu George completed his MBBS in India and he's trained as a pediatric registrar at the Mercy Deanery, Liverpool, and subsequently completed his pediatric neurology and neurodisability training at the Northern Deanery, Newcastle, UK. He has dual certification in general pediatrics and pediatric neurodisability from the Royal College of Pediatrics, UK. He has also worked as an honorary researcher in autism spectrum disorders in the ASD UK database at the Royal Victoria Infirmary, Newcastle. He has presented in international conferences and has also published papers on various topics. He worked as a pediatric neurodisability consultant at Sunderland, UK, before moving to the UAE. He currently heads the Child Development Department at the Royal Hospital in Abu Dhabi. So that's lots and lots of qualifications. And also, Doctor, how long have you been working in Abu Dhabi?
Hi, Madhavi. Thank you for having me again. And it's an absolute pleasure to be able to participate in such a endeavor. And I think this is really, really the right time for us to get all of these professionals on the same page and try and improve and actually work on the development, if I may use the word, of these services in India. I think it's very important. So coming back to your question, I've now been in Abu Dhabi for almost 4 years. Again, the dream was to start services similar to what we were able to provide the children in the UK in Abu Dhabi. And this is what we're trying to do now. So this is the perfect place because the government is quite keen and this is the right time and things are coming to fruition. So there we go.
Yeah, perfect. I mean, I met you at the right time. It just so happened, I think when something's meant to happen, it'll happen. I've been looking for a doctor like you to collaborate with to bring this awareness to India, because a lot of times doctors who have not been outside India and seen disability and awareness happening, they don't understand how that works. Most of the times in India, the pediatricians refer the child off to a rehabilitation center, and there ends the story, and there's no collaboration that happens back and forth between the rehab professionals and the medical professionals. I wanted to bring that collaboration where we both talk to each other and work together to spread awareness, because most of the times when a doctor tells the same thing that a rehab professional tells, it has more impact on just a rehab professional telling the parents, because they feel that, especially in India, when doctors are kept at a very high pedestal and what a doctor says is respected highly by the parents. And when it comes from, a person who's so highly qualified as you and a doctor, parents will actually have get the message that we're trying to convey. Thank you so much for being that person for us. And take it away, Dr. George.
So just before I start, and again, I'll reiterate this message, I've said this to you before, that children who have special needs always need a team around them. Mm-hmm. And the doctor is just another member of that team, and probably, in my opinion, probably not the most useful member of the team. Nevertheless, I'm here and a very willing participant in all of these endeavors. And as we said, this lecture, which we want to talk about, is just about general development. I'm going to put the lecture on and then we can just talk through that. There we go. So we wanted to talk about development in childhood in a very generic fashion. Of course, development is a very broad topic, but I think it's really important for us to understand the basic principles of development. So I'm just going to start here. There we go. So I'm just going to minimize this. First question, what is development? And I try to answer this question, and I think there are two parts to it. And the first part is, I think we're having some technical issues here. So on the outside, development is the steady appearance of expected milestones of achievements. And this is what an external observer can see. And we record this in the first few years of life. And this straddles or covers different spheres of functions. There are different areas which we are looking at. So this is what we see on the outside. But on the inside, internally, there's a cascade of changes resulting in the effects that we can see outside. And these effects are what we call as milestones. So it's very important to understand that what you see externally is a function of what is happening internally. Generally, classically, the areas of development can be classified or categorized into a few different domains. And generally, 4 is what we used to use. We can expand it. There are people who use 7, 6, but we do physical, gross motor or fine motor. That means the big actions and the fine actions. Then we talk about social communication. And this is a really important one, which we're concentrating on. Language comes next. And finally, we talk about cognition. And I would like to put these things in this order. This is the very simplistic categorization of how we assess function. What is the external evidence? Well, the external evidence is the measurement of milestones. And when we're talking about development, what I would like to use is just concentrate on social communication today as one of the markers of what we're looking at. So we are going to, for the time being, ignore gross and fine motor, cognition, and even language, because I think communication is even more important than language, and definitely comes before. And we'll show you a slide a bit later on, which highlights that. I mean, a little baby, 2 months old, looks at his mother's face, and then there's a brief pause, and then the baby smiles. And this eye contact is one of the first evidence of social communication development. This is an extremely important and a very satisfying milestone for parents, new or old. All parents are expecting that first social smile. This is a really nice one, and this is pointing. There are 2 kinds of it, and we're really looking at pointing as a very important marker. 1 year to 15 months is when you should see it. And actually, this is a picture of my daughter with her uncle pointing out something far in the distance. She's about 2 there, so she's definitely got pointing really well established. But what we're talking about is a baby looking at some object, raising their index finger and pointing towards that object. This is basically highlighting the acknowledgement that the baby's mind is now made, that there is something which I have seen, and there is a possibility that the observer or the person sitting next to me has not seen this. So let me show it to them. And this is a very important social communication marker or milestone. So then we come to something called joint interest and attention. So once you've pointed something out, you're actually sharing attention with somebody. So then you take it the next stage further and try and analyze or communicate about that particular thing that you're sharing or that event that you're sharing. I'll show you a few pictures, and you can see in picture A that the lady is pointing to something with her index finger, and the child immediately looks. And the second one, the child is pointing to something and the lady is looking there. So these are joint attention. You point to something, you look, and there is a meaningful interaction about what we are looking at. The next 3 pictures highlight something called a 3-point gaze. And you can see in C1, the baby is looking at this little toy, and then immediately looks at the lady in C2, and then looks back at the toy. This 3-point gaze can happen object, person, object, like in this one. So the child is looking at the object, then in C2 the person, then the object. Or it can happen person, object, person. So this 3-point gaze is another very important indicator of social communication. Then at 24 months, we come to pretend play. And this is something you see quite often, children pretending to feed dolls, dress dolls, singing to dolls, and then slowly start interacting with each other and try to pretend that they're Superman. They can also use toys and pretend that this toy is something else and use it as something else. So pretend play is another important marker. At 3 years, there is something called seeing leads to knowing test. It's not a test that we use, but it is an important component of the theory of mind that kind of tells us that the brain is still maturing further and further. And if you look at this picture, and there is one child on the left called Sally, and she's touching the box, and there's another child on the right called Anne, and she's looking inside the box. So if we ask a 3-year-old, who do you think knows what's inside the box? A 3-year-old should be able to say that because Anne's the one looking inside, she will know what's inside the box. So this is a very important test which identifies the state of mind of another person, and a 3-year-old should be able to do that. This is a very important fundamental tenet or a principle when we are describing autism and the problems with autism. And then as you grow older, at 4 years, you have a false belief test or deception. At 6 years, there's more complex mind reading. And by 9 years, you can identify social faux pas or social don'ts, which you can recognize very easily. So, somebody who's doing something which is not acceptable in that social situation, a 9-year-old should be able to manage that. So what you can see is progression in a steady fashion. So even though it's the most visible for a child physically, sort of baby who's slowly beginning to crawl and then stands up and walks, you can see that even in social communication, there is a very nice progression of different skills and establishing a functional young person or an adult. So now we come to the science of early childhood development. And this is, I'm not going to bamboozle you with lots of terms, but I think it's really important fundamentally to understand what is happening. And then we can think about what is happening incorrectly. So this is the, the prima donna of this show. And this is a neuron, a single nerve cell. And this end, which has all the tufts, is the head or the body. And then there's a long fiber, and then at the end there are a few more tufts. That's the tail of the neuron. And this neuron, an individual neuron, is a component of a very vast network. So neurons don't live in isolation, and just like people, they make massive connections. And these connections, depending on how well they are used, they form paths. So for an example, you might meet 100 people, and you might get their phone numbers, and you might talk to them once. But 20 of them you might form a really good connection with, and 10 of them you form an amazing connection with. And that's your immediate social circle that decides how you are functioning, which events you're going to, which birthdays you're attending. And that gives you a very distinct personality. It's exactly the same with neurons. They meet up with hundreds and thousands and actually millions of nerve cells, each neuron. But then they decide which ones are worth keeping. And this decision is based on a lot of factors. And this decision, the factors affecting this decision affect our existence, our personality, and how we behave. These are actually very scientific slides. And actually what you can see are nerve cells. So you can see nerve cells from the left in a newborn. And I apologize for the clarity of this slide. And you can see there are nerve cells. The big thick dots with the tails are the nerve cells. And you can see there's a little fuzz around the dots, and that's the cells trying to establish connections. So slide A is a newborn, and this is not a human. These are mammalian, probably rat slides, which are very similar. But you can see by 1 month, you can see lots of cells develop. And at 6 months, you can see the establishment of connections. And at 2 years, there are a massive amount of connections being established. So you can see that as a mammal progresses, the structure just keeps on expanding, and there's a lot of connections happening. But if you bring it down to the basic level, you have one neuron getting an input, passing the message on, and there is an output. That's a very simple neural circuit. That looks like this, a little simple circuit. You can predict very easily what the outcome is going to be, but that's not the brain. The brain is an infinitely complicated circuit, millions and millions of connections and interconnections. And actually, this is a functional MRI, which identifies some of the tracts associated with some particular function. And you can see, if you can't make it out, the left side is the back of the brain here, and the right side is the front, and this is the brain stem. And you can see all these fibers like a complicated supercomputer reaching out. So fundamentally, if you imagine, this is the stimulus coming in, and if it goes down this way and gets a response, you can class it as what we would call normal behavior, normal movement, a normal flickering of a muscle. And if by some reason the pathway digressed and went down this way, you would get an alternative behavior. So this decision of which pathway is being formed is what affects. And this decision is what we're trying to establish. Where does it come from? So you can see that the external expression of the signal, the same signal, so loud noise, can lead to a child just looking up, uh, processing that this is absolutely fine and carrying on, or it can go to this pathway where the child's um, brain is now programmed to react hyper stimuli, hyperreaction, close their ears, get distressed, and that behavior could then be called ASD. So that is the fundamental culprit. But development is widespread. It's extremely complex. And when we talk about the basics of development, the first thing is brains are built over time. So you don't have the established structure ready to go. It has to be slowly built over depending on the needs and requirements of this particular brain. It starts before birth and continues into adulthood. So the brain is slowly being formed and being improved as the children are getting older. This is really important. I mean, this is a no-brainer, excuse the pun, but the early experiences affect the quality of that architecture. What the child is experiencing, what the child is seeing and feeling and hearing is all going to change that brain structure. And this is common sense, but it's proven by research. Now, this was news to me as well. I used to think this would be a few 100,000, but recent research says that in the earliest part of the brain connection, there are 1 million new neural connections being formed every second. So this little baby brain is expanding rapidly, connecting to all kinds of cells, trying to establish the best pathways. Once it's connected, it starts utilizing the brain, and the pathways that are utilized and have got a lot of reward keep on getting established and getting stronger. And over the years, and even up to teenage, actually practically late teens, early 20s, then these extra connections start dying off. So imagine a shrub or a bush and somebody's got pruning shears and they're trying to trim the bush down. This is what happens. This is why a teenager who is so unpredictable, by the time they're 22, 23, starts settling down, because all the aberrant or extra connections are being removed. What's more important is there is an order to the connections being built. And this is a lovely slide which shows that if this is birth, and even before birth, lots of cells are being laid down. But the first pathways which are really put forward, and by 6 months, you can see there's a peak of establishment, are the sensory pathways. So vision, hearing, probably touch, taste are being established first. And then you can see language is the one which is being pushed onto, and it takes a peak by around 10, 11 months. Yes, connections are being set. And higher cognitive functions or intelligence, these pathways are also being laid simultaneously, but they peak around a year and beyond. So by, let's say there, 3, 4, you've got your neural pathways ready for cognition. So a 4-year child is very different from a 1-year-old child. What are the interactive influences? I mean, we know that genes and experience together shape the developing brain. I mean, in clinic, the amount of times you find a child with a particular problem and you ask about similar associated problems in the family, close family, you find a lot of candidates who have this similar pattern. So it has to be in the genes. But then the other issue is that you say two identical twins may develop differently, and children in the family do develop differently. So there is definitely the environment which is providing a lot of input into this. There's something called the serve and return relationship between children and their parents. So the child makes a response that, or serves, like in tennis, and the parent returns it. And this to and fro is what nurtures and builds connection. So this is really important. And the quality of these determine, not on their own, not the sole thing, but definitely are a very important factor contributing to how the child's intelligence and ability to communicate and all of these different factors which make the personality are shaped. So the brain's capacity for change decreases with age. I mean, this is, you can't teach an old dog new tricks is a very old saying, and this is a scientific reason for that. So initially at around 2 years of age, even the tiniest amount of effort, actually you don't need any effort, and the brain is learning. And this ability to change is rapidly fading down. And the effort required to make this change is rapidly increasing. So here you can, with even a little bit, you can get a lot of change in the brain. But somewhere around, there you're saying, well, you can try really hard and nothing's going to happen. And those old habits die hard. So this is the evidence for it. So we know that the early brain is more plastic. Um, the maturing brain, we know is specialized. So when you're around here, this brain is now becoming more and more specialized. And to change these specialized skills requires a lot more effort. Here we are very immature. So we are picking up skills very rapidly. It's true, and we know that there is enough evidence that these individual functions do not function independently. They're all absolutely connected. All parts of the brain are absolutely connected to each other. And one of the things, for example, when I talk to children, to parents of children with brain damage, and we talk about vision, although the eye doctors will say the eyes are fine and the signals are reaching the brain by all their tests, we cannot even now understand or explain what the child is seeing. That's because once the signal reaches the brain, there are multiple centers looking at various aspects of vision and trying to stitch all this information together. So the camera is fine, the wiring is fine, but the processes of the computer are damaged. So all the centers are linked, and early skills are prerequisite for success in life. So we know that if a child is having shortage of some skills, we work really hard on that and quite early on, because we know that that directly ties in or predicts how well the child is going to do later in life. This is not really important scientific evidence of something we know innately, as a gut instinct, that if you have persistent stress, and this stress or toxic stress, we talk about stressful environment, abuse, lack of stimulation, and this is toxic stress. This is going to affect the way the nerves connect. And this is in the prefrontal cortex, or the front part of the brain, where all the executive decisions are made, and hippocampus. And what you can see here is that there's a typical neuron putting out lots of connections, and this is a damaged neuron with fewer connections. So this is from an animal experiment where there was lots of toxic stress. And this is normal. So this is really important. And then toxic stress doesn't just mean negative or angry, or it just can mean a severe deviation from expected developmental input. So, and I really think about this in terms of the excessive screen time we give children. That's not what we used to do. So if we didn't do that and expected a certain pattern of development, if we start doing it, we are going to see a different development. And unfortunately, in my personal experience, it is not what is predicted. So toxic stress definitely affects the way the nerves connect, and overall then will affect the behavior. We talk about biology, and we know that brain growth and brain structure will be affected. So if the way the nerves are connecting is abnormal, then brain growth and brain structure will be affected. In fact, we know that in children on the autism spectrum, we often find that the brain size is bigger. So there's lots more proliferation and much more unregulated proliferation. We talk about brain function, and these are all the areas which the brain is involved in. So in autism, a lot of different areas are involved. So this is just an example. This is not a talk about autism, but we know that in development, different parts of the brain are contributing. So we know that there are chemicals in the brain which act as signals, and they might be different in different problems, developmental problems, and difference in the way the electricity is conducted. But this is a question we're trying to answer, and this is the question which people want us to answer. What about genetics? Is there any evidence for genes being involved? And people think about chromosomes and genes, and how can we identify them, given that today there's so much technology? But the simple answer is yes, there is evidence. And we know that in twin studies, if one child, one identical twin has autism, the risk for the next one is about 60 to 90%. And everybody who works with children with autism or developmental problems knows that in twins, this is extremely common. And we know that it runs in the families, and lots of developmental problems run in the families. So we see parents sitting in front of us, and many a times a clinician or the practitioner can identify traits in one of the parents, or maybe an uncle or an aunt who comes to visit, which is being probably amplified in this little child. We also know that related neurodevelopmental conditions are more common in the same family. Language, dyslexia, hyperactivity runs around this index case, if I may use the term. And we often see what we call a broader phenotype, which means a presentation of behavior, but which is much more broad. It's not so focused and they are more functional, but you can see aspects of that in parents and siblings. Actually, broader autism phenotype, BAP, is a diagnosis we often find in siblings of children because there are lots of criteria or lots of behaviors you see, but they're not enough to reach a diagnosis of autism. And we know that a lot of chromosomal abnormalities are associated with autism. So, for example, there is a condition called neurofibromatosis, where you get these big brown marks on the body and you get lumps on the body. And the presence or the incidence of autism in neurofibromatosis is about 50 to 60%. So, that's pretty strong association. And there are many such genetic conditions. What basically means there's something to do with the genes, but the biggest problem we have with genetic diagnosis for developmental problems is that it's not a single gene and it's not just the gene. In many illnesses, if you've got the gene problem, let's say Down syndrome, you've got 3 chromosomes, number 21, whatever happens, whatever influence you get, the massive effect that this chromosomal abnormality has is present. You see the characteristics in almost all children who have that. But autism is not like that. It is governed by multiple genes, which govern multiple aspects, and also the environment. So the diagnostic use of genetics is very limited. So it's not as straightforward. So what you can see here is a chromosome, and that's the bunched up genetic material. Each chromosome has got a pair. So there are 2 of each. So number 1 will have 2, and on you on go up to number 23. So there are 23 pairs of chromosomes inside each cell. And you often open up a chromosome and you keep unraveling it and unraveling it. You get into these tight supercoils, which you can open up even more and more and more and more. And then you come to what we recognize as the DNA spiral. And each segment of the spiral is called a gene, And developmental problems are multi-gene, and they're likely multifactorial. And they also depend, you might have the gene, but how is that gene expressed? How is it coming across? So in one family member, it might be very mild, and somebody it might be quite a lot. And this is the science of epigenetics. I've just written that down. I'm not going to go into it. But a good example is blood pressure, or maybe even the height of a person. Let's take the height. So if you look at somebody, there can be one number, 6 feet or 5 feet 10 or 5 feet 5. But a height is not a single number. So even though we measure the maximum on top of the head, the height is made up of many smaller heights. So the size of your vertebrae, the size of your leg bones, your posture, the way your body is structured, all these little bones which come in the middle, and each is probably controlled by a separate gene. So what we see at the end as a single number is actually multiple numbers, all being controlled by multiple genes. Same is true of blood pressure. So your parent could have blood pressure, but it depends on your lifestyle. So you have a genetic risk because your parent has, but it depends on your lifestyle, your healthy attitudes, or the lack of, which affect finally if you have blood pressure or not. I mean, this is a gene project database showing somewhere around 869 genes. But this was some time ago. And these are all implicated, but they are not on their own causative of autism. So this is a nice summary, and I'm using autism as a marker for developmental problems. But you can see that there is genetic susceptibility, or in most cases, there is something in the genes, even though we can't find it. But if you look at the family, you find problems and issues there, language delay, hyperactivity in some member, a grandfather who's very strict and very to the point and does not change at all. Then you have these modifying environmental stresses like infection, toxins, medications. For me, I think one of the important factors is toxic shock, and that can be bad parenting or lack of stimulation or excessive screen time, which is completely different. And even though you don't see it as toxic shock, it is a very different experience to what other children are having. And somewhere in the Middle East, is where you see expats working, both of the parents. There's no social circle. And this is true of metropolitan cities in India as well, that the children are developing on their own. And then the screen comes in as a very good method of keeping kids busy and safe. All of this leads to an overactive immune system, possibly. And we have possibly these factors regarding the neuron and how they proliferate. And then all of these together present as the developmental problem, and in this case, autism. And I really like, the use of the graphic equalizer. If those of you who are old enough to remember, we had these little, stereos, and you used to have lots of dials. So imagine a stereo with a dial, which is controlling all aspects of what you hear. And instead of the 5 or 10 you see, imagine 1,000. And the output is the behavior which you're trying to judge. So this is your graphic equalizer. And I've just put the spectrum there and different skills, all of which add up to presenting a picture or painting a picture of this person. So depending on where you are, so you could be somewhere there or there for the other skills, and social awareness is here and something else is here. And this is, a sum of this would be a line like that, which would be where the child is. Somebody could have these dots somewhere spread somewhere here, and their line would be higher up. And then you kind of arbitrarily decide that this function, there's a line here, which is function, and you compare whether the child is functionally above or below. And this is true of not just one diagnosis, but all the developmental diagnoses which can exist in bits and pieces. And your previous spectrum, if you up one too much and up the other, you can find that you might get, if you extend the spectrum and add in hyperactivity and all of that, you might get variations in these different disorders. And actually, there is even gifted there. Somebody who's exceptionally intelligent, but if they have hyperactivity or anxiety, then you are disadvantaged. So these are all the expressions, and we've only talked about negative expressions, but we've got one positive expression there, and they all exist together and are presented together. So in summary, what I want to say is that development starts from very early on in life. It depends on neuronal connections. The connections themselves depend on the genetic background and the environmental influences. And all of these together come together and present a picture to you, which we try and judge based on different skills and functionality. So the most important thing is functionality. There is, in my personal opinion, no point in assessing a child for hyperactivity if he can go to school and still achieve and is bringing, very good results and has friendships, but is very active. I mean, a child who's not achieving because of those problems is the person we need to look for a diagnosis. So functionality is really important. And this picture of development is really important that we need to paint and present. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. George. That was really insightful presentation. I just have one or two questions. I think your presentation addressed pretty much everything I had in mind, and it is really simple, and I think parents and professionals can understand it pretty well. I just wanted to know, what do you think about epigenetics, in the role of epigenetics in the whole thing? Like nowadays, everybody talks about epigenetics. What do you think about epigenetics?
Epigenetics is a study of expression of genes. So you can have those genes, but how they're expressed or how the body reads those genes and decides what to do with that information and to what level. This is something which is being looked at quite a lot.
One request, Dr. George, could we please stop the screen share so we can see you?
Yeah. So epigenetics is, as I said, expression of genes.
Yeah.
Again, cutting edge technology, there is a lot going on, and this is called translational research, wherein how does it translate from the lab to the daily practice. In the future, I'm quite sure that we will have a lot more to work with. But to be really honest, at this point in time, in everyday practice, epigenetics has not translated for us for most of the developmental problems. So speech, language, developmental coordination, and you take it up to hyperactivity or developmental disorder. I think it's still, epigenetics is still in the realms of the lab and research, and for me has not translated into practice at the moment. Having said that, we have seen these changes in other illnesses and diseases. So a lot of metabolic syndromes, genetic syndromes. Now you've got medications that are improving things. So one can only hope and pray, if I may, that this comes to the help for our families and children soon as well.
Why I asked you that question was I'm in touch with some people who are working in this space, and some very senior researchers, and they tell me that epigenetics has a huge role to play in developmental delays and disorders, because the kind of environment that is created
Yeah,
for the child at home
yeah,
decides what genes probably are expressed
absolutely,
uh,
absolutely.
and then that could lead to delays or whatever developmental issues in children. So that's what I meant when I said the role of epigenetics in this. Yeah.
So the issue again with that is standardization of
Yeah.
what is an ideal environment and how do you standardize it across cultures.
Mm.
Even in a country like India, we are completely heterogeneous. If you, I mean, I was born and brought up in the north of India, but I belong to the south of India, and my holidays, I can see absolutely two different cultures. So how do you homogenize this or distill this advice to suit all cultures? And this is a big issue. The the precepts are absolutely right. And if you take an extreme example, we often heard of kids in orphanages before, in the Eastern Bloc countries who are very, lacking social stimulation and love and affection. And these kids presented with autism spectrum. This is an extreme situation. Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
But then if you scale it down and if you look at a child sitting in a house with a screen for 6 hours a day without much contact, and soon this becomes by rote, and the child, this is the most basic toy that we give a child, the push a button and get a response. Yeah. Imagine now you've got a device which if you use your finger, you can get infinite responses in color, sounds, rhythms, and this 1-year-old brain is just going to get sucked in.
Mm.
So yes, epigenetics will explain all of this beautifully, but I'm hoping that there are some very simple distillates of these which are immediately applicable across settings. And this is the issue, that how do you, and the other thing is the guilt, and that parents have a guilt. And I often see parents, working hard, 2 jobs, both parents are working and trying to get a better future for their children and themselves. And then they realize suddenly after 6 months or a year that the child has had the best of things in life, but has missed out completely on socialization and language and communication, and has been left at home. And how do you deal with that guilt? So I hope that all of this comes out in sensible, applicable, translatable messages, which we can apply across the board.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. It's so hard to have the standard, but a prescription of things that every parent needs to do, which will make their child so-called, normal,
Absolutely.
or that's impossible. But I'm sure there are a couple of things that you would tell all the parents to make sure that the child has, when they're growing up in their early years, especially 0 to 3, when they don't even go out of their houses to schools or nurseries, 0 to 3 years, what should be the home environment be like?
I think one of my so there are key few messages I give to somebody who comes to me at 18 months, and there are concerns raised about developmental issues, which may range from just communication or response to actually whether this is autism. I don't jump into diagnose at that age, but that does not stop me from advising what the things we need to do are. And depending on the intensity of the problem, my usual first recommendation is please stop screens. If possible, or if not possible, limit them down to as little as possible. And the American Academy of Pediatrics guidelines are there. But if you just think about it, if you want your child to learn to speak, the way we learned was listening to people and looking at how the mouths moved and their presence. And there are lots more, sensory input coming our way than a screen, especially if it's a cartoon which has got a comical YouTube video going on about alphabets. That's not how we learn to speak. We need to hear language. So first thing I say is switch off screens as much as possible. Second thing is, as much as possible, parents need to spend time with the child eye to eye. These could be held in activities which are like playing with the child, simple activities, building blocks, looking together, and the skills that I mentioned: joint attention, eye contact, 3-point gaze, pointing. We're going to practice all these skills at that age so that all these skills which are missing, we can develop them. Reading together. And if you are forced to use a video, please use it under supervision under 2.5, 3 years of age. And that should be something which you're getting something out of together in a very supervised manner, rather than leaving the child to completely disappear into that black hole of the screen and stop all communication. Diet wise, the only thing I would tell parents is please stop and identify excessive sugar. If it was left to me, I would say as much sugar out of the system as possible, because you already have a child who's struggling to establish a bond, and having juices and sweets and candies which may show a lot of pleasure in the face of the child, and the parents might think, oh, my kid is happy, but actually affect your the way your brain is working and how your neurons are responding, because there's a sugar rush. I would like the kids to have a routine if possible, and a routine is really important. This is basics, especially for little ones. Sleep is really important. Try and get them to have a nap in the day, because those little brains need a little bit more rest than we do. And most sleep practitioners will say that having a nap till 3.5 is really good for the child. I can say after 2.5, it depends on parental familial pressures, but if possible, they need to have a routine, very structured routine, so that things, are in expectation. And when they get older, I tell parents, especially during, when they're 3 and they're thinking of toilet training, please don't let a kid decide when they need to eat, when they need to sleep, and when they need to poo. Because if you leave that to them, you are going to have a lot of problem, and you're making a sword for your own back. Please don't do that. And having a structure is really important. We thrive with structures, and randomness and chaos leads to randomness and chaos. I'm not saying be regimented and have the light switched off and have a military band playing through, but having some kind of structure helps the kid to identify. So these are the basics I would tell parents. And if the socialization is really important, taking a kid to a mall is not socialization. Taking a kid to a park is not socialization. Sitting with the family members and letting the child explore the relationships of how friends and family are there and interacting with each other. This is how we learn. We are social animals. We were designed to sit in a cave for thousands of years in a huddle of people and wait and listen and identify. Now we are left in rooms with devices. And this has happened over the last 5 years. And we've out of caves for only last, maybe 5,000-10,000 years. But evolution has been millions of years. So we cannot change all of that. So don't go find a cave, but at least find a room where there are family and people engaging with each other. And this is a really important contribution.
Yeah. And also, Dr. George, I see parents leaving, that's what you just said. I'm just going to reiterate that. When parents let the child decide when they're going to bed, what time they're going to eat, what they're going to eat, how much of that they're going to eat. A 2-year-old doesn't know all that. He might like it. He might want to have candies whole day, morning to evening. Just because you can afford to have them in your refrigerator, don't give it to them. And also, like this new thing, it actually annoys me as a parent. I'm talking from a parent. Quality time in double quotes with their children doesn't work. Children need their full attention all the time. And a lot of parents, especially who are working, who come home at 11, 12 in the night, and the kids are waiting for them to come home so that they can have quality time from 12 to 1 in the night, because the child doesn't need to go to school next day. The kid goes to bed at 2 a.m. and wakes up at 2 p.m. in the morning. It's crazy.
For any children with developmental problems, sleep is really important. And we know that in a lot of children with autism spectrum, sleep is very disorganized. Hyperactivity sleep is very disorganized. So not only is it organized and as a presentation, but it's probably a result of what's happening. So we really need to work on that. The second thing, I as a parent myself, I think it's really important to know that probably trying to satisfy their every need as a parent is the most negative message we can get across, because then where does it stop? When will you stop it? And there are, and I think it's a lack of it's the nuclear families, lack of the whole social setup around them, guiding them what to do, and a lot of new parents are struggling and finding their own paths. brand this as convenience parenting, and I'm guilty. I've done it. I've got two kids, and sometimes you just have to get some work done, and you sit them in front of a screen, and they will stay there. You can feed them rocks, and they will eat, as long as something is going on the iPad. And in your life, that makes a big difference because you're trying to slot your time. But this is not how we were born and brought up, and we had the full attention of parents, and if they were doing something, we had other items to keep us busy and not a screen. So I am a very anti-screen person under 2 years of age, and although there is no evidence, there's no literature, but it's so difficult to gather. And if it has to be done, it has to be always under supervision. Leaving a kid alone with a screen which they can control either with a remote, which they know lots of 1 and 18-month-olds can put on YouTube on a smart TV, or the finger touch is an absolute no-no, either phone or tablet. So that is my short take on that.
So yeah, I think that's wonderful, and thank you so much again from our side for speaking at the summit. I'm sure parents will learn, and professionals also know what to advise to parents who come to them with these questions. Thank you so much for your time,
It
Doctor.
was a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.